I stood at the edge of my property line, watching 1,500 cattle crowding around empty water troughs. The dust clouds rising from their restless movement painted the sky a dirty brown. My hand rested on the metal valve that controlled their entire water supply. For 3 months, the HOA had blocked every attempt I made to dig a well on my own ranch. They buried me in permits, fees, and impossible demands. They treated me like a criminal for wanting water on my own land. They thought they held all the power. But as I watched those cattle grow more desperate by the hour, I realized something that made my blood run cold. The HOA had been stealing water from my property for years. They built their entire cattle operation on water that legally belonged to me. That was when I understood the true scope of their greed, and that was when I decided to shut off their water forever. Uncle Frank left me everything: 500 acres of rolling hills, weathered barns, an endless sky that stretched beyond the horizon. When the lawyer handed me those keys, I felt like I was holding the weight of 3 generations of family history. I had spent 15 years climbing the corporate ladder in Dallas, wearing suits that cost more than most people made in a month. But that morning, standing in the lawyer's office, I knew my life was about to change forever. Uncle Frank had always told me that real freedom came from owning your own land. Now, I finally understood what he meant. The drive out to the ranch took 2 hours through winding country roads. When I finally pulled up to the main house, the sun was setting behind the hills, painting everything in shades of gold and amber. The old farmhouse sat like a fortress against the landscape, its wraparound porch and tin roof telling stories of decades past. I walked the property for hours that first day, my city shoes crunching on gravel paths that Uncle Frank had walked every morning for 40 years. The barns needed work, the fences needed repair, but the bones of something beautiful were there. I could see it all in my mind. Cattle grazing in the pastures, horses running free, maybe even a small crop operation. But there was one problem that became clear within the first week. The old well had run dry years ago. Uncle Frank had been trucking in water for the last few years of his life, something he never mentioned to anyone. The previous owner had dug the well in the 1940s, and it had served the property faithfully until recently. I spent days researching well drilling companies, getting quotes, and planning the perfect spot for a new well. The excitement was almost overwhelming. This would be my first real step toward true self-sufficiency. No more depending on city water systems or monthly bills. Just me, my land, and the water beneath it. That was when I discovered something that made my stomach drop. Despite being in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by open country and farmland, my ranch somehow fell under the jurisdiction of the Willowbrook Homeowners Association, the same HOA that managed the new development built on the neighboring property. I called the HOA office, expecting a simple conversation about permit procedures. The woman who answered sounded friendly enough, and she explained that any major construction projects, including well drilling, required HOA approval. She made it sound routine, almost boring. I gathered all my documentation: soil surveys, water table reports, drilling permits from the county, and detailed plans showing exactly where I wanted to place the well. I even included historical documents showing that wells had been dug on the property for decades. Walking into that first HOA meeting, I felt confident and prepared. I had done everything by the book. I had followed every rule, dotted every I, and crossed every T. How hard could it be to get approval for a well on my own land? I had no idea that I was walking into a trap that would consume the next 6 months of my life and cost me thousands of dollars in legal fees. I had no idea that the friendly woman on the phone worked for people who saw my ranch not as a family legacy, but as an obstacle to their own plans. The Willowbrook HOA met in a sterile conference room that smelled like industrial carpet and broken dreams. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting harsh shadows on the faces of 5 board members who sat behind a long table like judges at a trial. I had arrived early, my folder thick with documentation and my confidence still intact. The other property owners filed in slowly, most looking tired and defeated. I wondered how many of them had sat in these same chairs, fighting their own battles against bureaucratic nonsense. The president, Margaret Henley, was a woman in her 60s with silver hair pulled back so tight it seemed to stretch her face. She looked at me like I was something unpleasant she had found on her shoe. When my turn came to present, she did not even look up from her papers. "Mr. Thompson," she said, her voice sharp and dismissive, "you are requesting permission to drill a water well on your property. Have you completed the environmental impact study?" I blinked, confused. Environmental impact study for a water well. Any construction that could affect groundwater requires a full environmental assessment. That will be $15,000, payable to our approved consulting firm. My heart sank. $15,000 for a study that would take months to complete, but I kept my voice calm and professional. "I was not aware of that requirement. Can you provide me with the specific regulations?" Margaret smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "We also require soil stability testing, mineral rights verification, and easement agreements with all adjacent properties. Each of these will require separate studies and fees." The board member to her right, a thin man with a pointed beard, leaned forward. "There is also the matter of aesthetic impact. A well structure could affect property values throughout the development." I felt my face flush with anger, but I forced myself to stay calm. This is a working ranch. It has had wells for over 70 years. I am not building anything that would affect anyone's property values. "That is not for you to decide," Margaret said, her tone suggesting the conversation was over. "We require all studies to be completed before we can even consider your application." I left that meeting with a list of requirements that would cost me over $50,000 and take at least 6 months to complete. Each study required pre-approval from the HOA, and each approval required additional fees. It was a maze designed to frustrate and exhaust anyone who dared to challenge their authority. But I was determined to play by their rules. I hired the environmental consulting firm, paid for the soil testing, and spent weeks tracking down easement agreements from neighbors who thought the whole thing was ridiculous. Every document I filed was perfect. Every requirement met exactly as specified. 3 months later, I returned to the HOA meeting with a completed application that was 3 inches thick. I had done everything they asked for, spent more money than the well would cost, and followed every single rule in their book. Margaret looked through the documents with theatrical slowness, occasionally making notes on a yellow legal pad. The silence stretched for 15 minutes while she read, the only sound the hum of fluorescent lights and the scratch of her pen. Finally, she looked up at me with that same cold smile. "Mr. Thompson, after careful review of your application, the board has decided to deny your request for a water well permit." The words hit me like a physical blow. "What? Why? I completed every requirement you gave me." "The board has determined that additional wells in this area could negatively impact the water table and potentially harm existing water sources. We cannot approve your application." I stared at her in disbelief. "You have been stringing me along for 3 months, taking my money, making me jump through hoops, and now you are just denying it anyway. The board's decision is final, she said, already moving on to the next item on her agenda. I walked out of that meeting feeling like I had been punched in the gut. 3 months of my life, $50,000 and countless hours of work, all for nothing. But as I sat in my truck in the parking lot, something else began to replace the disappointment. Anger, pure, cold anger that started in my chest and spread through my entire body. They had played me from the beginning, and I had been too naive to see it. I could not sleep that night. I sat in Uncle Frank's old office, surrounded by cardboard boxes full of property documents, legal papers, and family records that went back generations. If the HOA thought they could just steamroll me, they had another thing coming. I started with the property deed, tracing every boundary line and easement. Then I moved to the mineral rights documentation, something Uncle Frank had always been careful to maintain. Most property owners never paid attention to their mineral rights, but Uncle Frank had been in the oil business before he became a rancher. That was when I found the first clue. A geological survey from 1987 that showed a major aquifer running beneath both my property and the HOA's development. The survey was incredibly detailed, showing water flow patterns, depth measurements, and estimated capacity. I spread the topographical maps across the desk, comparing them with the geological survey. My hands were shaking as I traced the underground water flow with my finger. The aquifer started on my property, flowed northeast under the HOA development, and continued for miles beyond. But the truly shocking discovery came when I started researching water rights law. In Texas, if you own the land, you own the water beneath it. The aquifer originated on my property, which meant I owned the primary water rights to the entire underground system. I called every water rights attorney in a 50-mile radius until I found one who specialized in cases like mine. Sarah Martinez had been fighting water rights battles for 20 years, and when I described my situation, she got very quiet. "Bring me everything you have," she said. "Property deeds, mineral rights, geological surveys, everything. If what you are telling me is true, you might have a case." 2 days later, I sat in Sarah's office while she reviewed my documents. She had spread everything across a conference table, and I watched her face grow more serious with each page she turned. "This is incredible," she said finally. "You own the primary water rights to an aquifer that supplies water to over 3,000 acres. Do you have any idea how much water that is?" I shook my head, afraid to hope. "We need to do our own geological survey, but if these documents are accurate, you control the water supply for that entire development, including their cattle operation." That was when Sarah told me something that made my blood run cold. The HOA had been operating their cattle ranch for 5 years, but they had never filed for water rights permits. They had been illegally tapping into the aquifer that originated on my property. "They have been stealing your water," Sarah said, her voice filled with quiet fury. "Not only that, but they owe you 5 years of back fees for unauthorized water usage. We are talking about hundreds of thousands of dollars." I hired a private geological surveying company to conduct a secret assessment of the aquifer. They used ground-penetrating radar and other equipment to map the underground water system without anyone knowing what we were doing. The results were even better than I had hoped. The aquifer was massive, and my property sat directly over the primary source. The HOA's cattle operation was completely dependent on water that legally belonged to me. But the most shocking discovery came when we investigated their water usage patterns. They were pumping over 50,000 gallons per day from the aquifer, enough to supply a small city. Their 1,500 head of cattle were drinking water that they had no legal right to use. I spent the next week documenting everything. Sarah helped me file water rights claims with the state, establishing my legal ownership of the aquifer. We also prepared cease and desist orders, demanding that the HOA stop all unauthorized water usage immediately. Sitting in my truck at the edge of my property, I looked across the fence at the HOA's cattle operation. Hundreds of black and brown cattle grazed peacefully in the afternoon sun, completely unaware that their water supply was about to disappear. For 3 months, the HOA had held all the power. They had made me dance to their tune, jump through their hoops, and pay their ridiculous fees. They had treated me like a beggar asking for scraps from their table. But now I held all the cards. I owned the water that kept their entire operation running. I had the legal authority to shut them down with a single phone call. The question was what to do with that power. Sarah had advised me to give them one chance to make things right before we took more drastic action. It was the decent thing to do, even though they had shown me no decency at all. I decided to go back to the HOA one more time, but this time I would not be begging for permission. This time I would be delivering an ultimatum. Sarah and I spent 2 weeks building our case like generals planning a military campaign. Every document was perfect, every legal argument ironclad. We filed water rights claims, cease and desist orders, and calculated damages for 5 years of unauthorized water usage. The numbers were staggering. The HOA owed me over $400,000 in back fees for illegal water usage. Their cattle operation had been built on stolen water, and they had been operating without proper permits for years. But I wanted to give them one chance to make things right. Despite everything they had put me through, I was not looking for total war. I just wanted what was legally mine and the right to dig a well on my own property. Sarah accompanied me to the next HOA meeting, her briefcase filled with enough legal documents to bury the entire board. I had called ahead to request time on the agenda, and Margaret had agreed with obvious reluctance. Walking into that conference room felt completely different this time. 3 months ago, I had been a supplicant begging for permission. Now I was a property owner asserting my legal rights. The fluorescent lights still buzzed overhead, but the balance of power had shifted completely. Margaret looked up as we entered, her face showing the first sign of concern I had ever seen. "Mr. Thompson, I understand you have some additional information to present to the board." I stood and placed a thick folder on the table in front of her. "I do. I have discovered that the HOA has been operating without proper water rights permits for the past 5 years. You have been illegally using water from an aquifer that originates on my property." The silence in the room was deafening. Margaret opened the folder and began reading, her face growing paler with each page. The other board members leaned forward, trying to see what had captured her attention so completely. "This is ridiculous," said the thin man with the pointed beard. "We have been operating here for 5 years. We have every right to use groundwater." Sarah leaned forward, her voice calm and professional. "Actually, you do not. Under Texas water law, Mr. Thompson owns the primary water rights to the aquifer that supplies your entire operation. You have been using his water without permission or payment." Margaret looked up from the documents, her face now completely white. "What exactly are you proposing?" I took a deep breath, knowing this was my moment. "I am proposing that we settle this matter quickly and fairly. I want immediate approval for my water well, with no further delays or requirements. I want a public apology for the treatment I have received, and I want reimbursement for all the legal fees and consulting costs you forced me to pay." The room erupted in angry voices. Board members spoke over each other, demanding to know how this was possible, threatening to fight us in court, insisting that we were wrong about the law. But Margaret held up her hand, silencing the others. She had been reading Sarah's legal brief, and she understood exactly what we were telling her. "If we do not agree to your terms, what happens then?" she asked. I looked her directly in the eyes. "Then I exercise my legal right to control access to my water. I can shut off your water supply immediately, and your cattle operation will have no water source." The pointed-beard man slammed his hand on the table. "You cannot do that. We will sue you for damages." Sarah opened her briefcase and pulled out another document. "Actually, he can do exactly that. And if you sue him, we will countersue for 5 years of unauthorized water usage. Our damages claim is over $400,000. Margaret stared at the documents for a long moment, then looked up at me with pure hatred in her eyes. "You are trying to blackmail us." "I am trying to resolve this matter fairly," I replied. "You have been using my water without permission for 5 years. I am offering you a chance to make things right without going to court." She stood up abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. "This board will not be intimidated by threats. We will fight this in court if necessary." I gathered my documents and stood to leave. "You have 7 days to respond to our offer. After that, we will take whatever action we deem necessary to protect Mr. Thompson's water rights." As we walked toward the door, Margaret's voice followed us. "You are making a big mistake, Mr. Thompson. You have no idea who you are dealing with." I turned back to face her, feeling calmer than I had in months. "Actually, I know exactly who I am dealing with. The question is whether you understand who you are dealing with." Walking out of that conference room, I felt like a different person than the one who had walked in 3 months earlier. I was no longer the naive city guy who thought he could trust the system to treat him fairly. I was a property owner who understood his rights and was prepared to fight for them. And I had just delivered an ultimatum that would change everything. 7 days passed without a word from the HOA. I had hoped they would see reason, that faced with overwhelming legal evidence, they would choose compromise over confrontation. But their silence told me everything I needed to know about their intentions. Sarah had prepared all the necessary legal documents. We had filed our water rights claims with the state, obtained preliminary injunctions, and documented every aspect of the HOA's illegal water usage. Every action we planned to take was completely legal and fully documented. The night before I planned to shut off their water supply, I could not sleep. I walked the property in the darkness, thinking about Uncle Frank and what he would have done in this situation. He had always been a fair man, but he had also been tough as nails when people tried to take advantage of him. I had given the HOA every opportunity to resolve this peacefully. I had offered them reasonable terms, asked for nothing more than what was legally mine, and been willing to forgive 5 years of water theft. Their response had been arrogance and threats. The main water control valve was located in a concrete housing near the property line. It was a simple wheel valve that controlled the flow of water from the aquifer to the HOA's distribution system. Uncle Frank had installed it years ago when he had allowed the previous property owner to share water during a drought. I arrived at the valve at sunrise, carrying a video camera to document every action I took. Sarah had insisted on complete documentation to protect us from any legal challenges. I set up the camera on a tripod and began recording. This is day 8 after delivering our ultimatum to the Willowbrook HOA, I said to the camera. They have refused to respond to our reasonable settlement offer. As the legal owner of the water rights to this aquifer, I am now exercising my right to control access to my water. My hands were shaking as I reached for the valve wheel. This was the point of no return. Once I shut off their water supply, there would be no going back to the way things were. The valve turned easily, and I could hear the water flow stopping immediately. The sound echoed across the landscape like a gunshot. I had just cut off the water supply to 1,500 head of cattle. Within 2 hours, I could see the effects of my action. Cattle that had been grazing peacefully in the morning were now crowding around empty water troughs. Dust clouds began rising from the HOA property as the animals became restless and confused. My phone started ringing at 10 in the morning. The first call was from Margaret, her voice shrill with panic. "What have you done?" she screamed into the phone. "You have shut off our water supply. Our cattle will die." I kept my voice calm and professional. "I have exercised my legal right to control access to my water. You have 7 days to respond to our settlement offer before we take further action." "You cannot do this. This is illegal. We will have you arrested." "Actually, it is completely legal. I own the water rights, and I have the legal authority to control access. You are welcome to call the sheriff if you would like them to confirm that." She hung up on me, but the phone kept ringing. Board members, HOA lawyers, and even some of the cattle operation employees called throughout the day. Each conversation was the same: panic, threats, and demands that I turn the water back on immediately. But I had made my decision. I would not be bullied or threatened into backing down. They had chosen this path when they refused to negotiate in good faith. By evening, I could see trucks arriving at the HOA property. They were bringing in temporary water tanks, trying to provide emergency water for the cattle. But 1,500 head of cattle require thousands of gallons of water per day. No amount of trucked water could sustain them for long. I sat on my porch that evening, watching the sunset paint the hills in shades of red and gold. The dust clouds from the HOA property had settled, but I could still see the emergency lights from the water trucks working into the night. Part of me felt guilty about the cattle. They were innocent animals caught in the middle of a human conflict. But I also knew that this was the only way to force the HOA to take our legal position seriously. Sarah called to check on me. "How are you holding up?" "I am fine," I said, though I was not entirely sure that was true. "Any word from their lawyers?" "They filed an emergency injunction this afternoon, demanding that you restore water access immediately. I filed our response, along with all the documentation proving your water rights. The judge will hear arguments tomorrow morning." I knew that the next 24 hours would determine the outcome of this entire conflict. Either the court would support my legal rights, or I would be forced to surrender to HOA bullying. But I had played this game by their rules for 3 months and I had lost. Now we were playing by my rules, and I intended to win. The emergency court hearing was scheduled for 10 in the morning. I barely slept, knowing that everything depended on the judge's decision. If the court ruled against me, the HOA would have won through legal manipulation, just as they had tried to do with bureaucratic manipulation. Sarah met me at the courthouse at 9, carrying boxes of documents that proved our case. The HOA's legal team was already there, 3 lawyers in expensive suits who looked like they had been pulled away from more important cases. Judge Patricia Williams was a no-nonsense woman in her 50s who had a reputation for cutting through legal nonsense to get to the heart of matters. She listened to both sides present their arguments, occasionally asking pointed questions that made the HOA lawyers squirm. "Let me make sure I understand this correctly," she said after hearing the initial presentations. "The defendant owns the land where this aquifer originates, and he has properly filed water rights claims with the state. The plaintiff has been using water from this aquifer for 5 years without filing for water rights or paying usage fees. Is that correct?" The HOA's lead attorney, a man with silver hair and a $5,000 suit, stood up. "Your Honor, they have been operating a legitimate business for 5 years. They cannot simply have their water supply cut off without notice." "They had 7 days' notice," Sarah interjected. "We delivered our settlement offer a week ago, and they chose not to respond." Judge Williams looked through the documents for several minutes, paying particular attention to the geological surveys and water rights filings. Finally, she looked up at both legal teams. "The law is clear on this matter. Water rights in Texas belong to the property owner where the water originates. The defendant has legal authority to control access to his water. The plaintiff's emergency injunction is denied." The HOA lawyers looked stunned. Their client had been operating illegally for 5 years, and the court had just confirmed that I had every right to shut off their water supply. Walking out of the courthouse, I felt vindicated but not victorious. I still wanted to resolve this matter without destroying the HOA's cattle operation. But they had forced this confrontation by refusing to negotiate in good faith. My phone rang constantly for the next 3 days. The calls started with anger and threats, but gradually shifted to bargaining and pleading. Margaret called 6 times on the second day, each conversation more desperate than the last. "Our cattle are suffering," she said during one call. "Some of them are showing signs of dehydration. You have to turn the water back on." "I have offered you a reasonable settlement," I replied. "Approve my well permit, apologize for the treatment you have given me, and reimburse my legal expenses. Those are my terms." "We cannot pay your legal expenses. Do you have any idea how much money that is?" "Do you have any idea how much money you owe me for 5 years of unauthorized water usage? $400,000 in back fees, plus damages for the harm you have caused me." She hung up on me again, but called back 2 hours later. The HOA tried everything they could think of to get around my legal position. They contacted other drilling companies, trying to find someone who would dig a new well without permits. They investigated connecting to the municipal water system, but the cost was prohibitive and would take months to complete. They even tried to go around me entirely, contacting other property owners in the area to see if anyone would sell them water rights. But the aquifer was unique to my property, and no one else had access to the volume of water they needed. On the 4th day, I received an unexpected visitor. Sheriff Tom Morrison, a man I had known since childhood, drove up to my house in his patrol car. But instead of coming to arrest me, he came to ask questions. "I have been getting a lot of calls about this water situation," he said, settling into a chair on my porch. "The HOA folks are pretty upset. They are claiming you are trying to put them out of business." I handed him a copy of the court order and the water rights documentation. "I am exercising my legal rights to control access to my water. The court has confirmed that I have every right to do what I am doing." Tom read through the documents carefully, then looked up at me with a slight smile. "So they have been stealing your water for 5 years, and now they are mad that you caught them. That is about the size of it. Well, I cannot say I blame you. If someone had been stealing from me for 5 years, I would probably do the same thing. On the fifth day, Margaret herself showed up at my front door. She looked like she had not slept in days, her usually perfect appearance disheveled and desperate. "Please," she said, her voice breaking, "we are willing to negotiate. Just turn the water back on while we work out the details." I looked at her for a long moment, this woman who had made my life miserable for 3 months. Part of me wanted to feel sorry for her, but I remembered her smug smile when she had denied my well permit. "The terms are the same as they were a week ago," I said. "Full approval for my well, a public apology and reimbursement for my legal expenses. You have 24 hours to decide." She stared at me in shock. 24 hours, we need more time. "You have had 5 days to find alternative water sources. You have had a week to respond to our settlement offer. You have had 3 months to treat me fairly. 24 hours is what you get." As she walked back to her car, I could see the defeat in her shoulders. The HOA had finally realized that they were not dealing with someone they could bully into submission. The next morning, my phone rang at exactly 8 o'clock. It was Margaret, and her voice was different. Gone was the arrogance and hostility. In its place was the weary resignation of someone who had finally accepted defeat. "We accept your terms," she said simply. "When can we meet to sign the agreements?" The signing ceremony took place in Sarah's office on a Tuesday morning in late September. The HOA's legal team had prepared all the documents according to our specifications, and Margaret sat across from me looking like she had aged 10 years in the past 2 weeks. The first document was the immediate and unconditional approval of my water well permit. No additional studies, no extra fees, no bureaucratic delays. Just a simple approval that should have been granted 6 months earlier. The second document was a public apology that would be published in the local newspaper and mailed to every property owner in the development. It acknowledged that the HOA had treated me unfairly and had operated their cattle ranch without proper water rights permits. The third document was a check for $37,000, reimbursing me for all the legal fees, consulting costs, and other expenses the HOA had forced me to pay during their bureaucratic circus. But the most important document was the comprehensive water rights agreement that established clear boundaries and usage rights for the aquifer. The HOA would pay fair market rates for continued water access, and I would have complete authority over my water source. Margaret signed each document with shaking hands, her face a mask of barely controlled rage. When the last signature was complete, she looked up at me with pure hatred. "I hope you are satisfied," she said, her voice dripping with venom. "I am satisfied with justice being served," I replied. "You brought this on yourself by refusing to negotiate in good faith." After she left, Sarah and I sat in her office reviewing the signed agreements. 6 months of legal warfare had finally come to an end, and I had won completely. "You realize this is going to change everything," Sarah said. "Word is going to get out about this case, and other property owners are going to start asserting their rights against HOA overreach." She was right. Within a week of the newspaper apology being published, I received calls from property owners across the county who were dealing with their own HOA nightmares. The story had spread through social media and local news, inspiring others to fight back against bureaucratic bullying. 2 weeks after the settlement, I stood on my property watching the drilling crew set up equipment for my new water well. The sound of the drill breaking through earth and rock was like music to my ears. After 6 months of fighting, I was finally getting what I had wanted from the beginning. The well came in strong, producing over 100 gallons per minute of clean, fresh water. It was more than enough to supply the entire ranch operation I had planned, with plenty left over for future expansion. But the real victory was not just about the water. It was about standing up to bullies who thought they could use bureaucracy and intimidation to take what did not belong to them. It was about proving that individual property owners still had rights that could not be trampled by petty officials drunk on power. 6 months later, I received a call from a reporter who was writing a story about HOA reform. She had heard about my case and wanted to interview me about the broader implications of water rights and property ownership. What advice would you give to other property owners who are dealing with HOA overreach? She asked. I thought about that question for a long time before answering. Know your rights and be prepared to fight for them. These people count on you being intimidated by their bureaucracy and legal threats. But if you have the law on your side and the determination to see it through, you can win. The ranch has thrived in the years since the water war ended. I have expanded the cattle operation, planted crops, and even built a small guest house for visitors. The reliable water supply from my well has made all of it possible. More importantly, the legal precedent from my case has helped dozens of other property owners assert their rights against HOA overreach. Margaret resigned from the HOA board 6 months after our settlement, and the entire board was replaced by people who understood the importance of working with property owners rather than against them. Last week, I was standing by my well at sunset, watching the water flow freely into the storage tank. The sound of running water had become the soundtrack of my daily life, a constant reminder of the battle I had fought and won. Uncle Frank would have been proud. He had always believed that a man's property rights were sacred, and that sometimes you had to fight to protect what was yours. The ranch he left me had become exactly what he had dreamed it would be, a place where a person could live free from the interference of petty bureaucrats and power-hungry officials. The water flows freely now as it should, and I sleep peacefully at night, knowing that I stood up for my rights when it mattered most. Sometimes the fight is worth it, even when the odds seem impossible. Especially when the odds seem impossible.